Something massive is moving through the Strait of Gibraltar right now, and the governments in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing are watching it very, very carefully. The United States Navy has just deployed one of the most powerful naval strike groups on Earth into the Mediterranean Sea, and the timing of this move is no accident. This is not a routine patrol. This is not a training exercise. This is Washington sending a message written in steel, jet fuel, and 5-inch naval guns, and the entire Middle East is already reacting. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Mediterranean Sea actually means in the modern world. It is not just a body of water separating Europe from Africa, it is the single most strategically important stretch of ocean on the planet. Whoever controls the Mediterranean controls the flow of oil from the Middle East to Europe, controls the sea lanes connecting the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal, and controls the military high ground from which strikes can be launched across 3 continents within minutes. The ancient Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Today, the Americans want to remind everyone exactly who that sea belongs to. But this is where things start to get complicated. The U.S. Navy carrier strike group that has entered the Mediterranean is built around one of America's nuclear-powered supercarriers, a ship so large that it carries more combat aircraft than the entire air forces of most countries in the world. These vessels displace over 100,000 tons of water. They are roughly 330 meters long. They carry squadrons of FA-18 Super Hornets, E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft, electronic warfare jets, and a full complement of helicopters capable of submarine hunting. Surrounding this carrier are guided missile cruisers, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and at least one fast attack submarine gliding silently somewhere beneath the surface. This is not a show of force. This is force itself, moving at 30 knots toward one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The question everyone in the intelligence community is now asking is simple: why now? The answer requires a brief journey back through recent months of escalating tension between Washington and Tehran. Iran has spent the better part of the last several years systematically expanding its military reach across the Middle East in ways that have alarmed not just the United States, but Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, and every Gulf state sitting between them. Iranian-backed proxy forces have launched hundreds of drone and missile attacks across the region. The Houthi movement in Yemen, armed and directed by Tehran, conducted one of the most audacious naval disruption campaigns in modern history, firing ballistic missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles at commercial vessels transiting the Red Sea. Global shipping was rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, insurance premiums skyrocketed, global supply chains were stretched, and through all of it, Iran maintained the fiction that its hands were clean. But here is where things become genuinely dangerous. While the proxy campaign raged in Yemen and across Iraq and Syria, Iran was doing something else entirely. Deep inside hardened underground facilities, Iranian nuclear scientists were advancing the country's uranium enrichment program to levels that left very little ambiguity about the ultimate destination of that work. Western intelligence agencies, satellite imagery analysts, and international nuclear inspectors all arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion: Iran was closer to a nuclear weapons breakout capability than at any point in its history. Not weeks away, perhaps not even months. The threshold that the United States and Israel had repeatedly declared to be a red line was being approached in real time. Israel made its position clear through back-channel communications and very public statements from its senior military commanders. If diplomacy could not stop Iran's nuclear program, then military action would. And Israel has proven before, most notably in its strikes against nuclear facilities in Iraq in 1981 and in Syria in 2007, that it is not simply making rhetorical threats. The Israeli Air Force, equipped with F-35I Adir stealth fighters and long-range refueling tankers, had already conducted quiet rehearsal exercises over the Mediterranean for exactly this kind of deep strike mission. Washington found itself standing at a crossroads. A unilateral Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would almost certainly trigger a massive Iranian retaliation. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal is the largest and most diverse in the Middle East. Its Shahab, Imad, and Fatah missile families can reach targets across Israel, across the Gulf states, and into Eastern Europe. A retaliatory barrage of this scale would draw the United States in regardless of what Washington wanted, because American bases from Qatar to Bahrain to Iraq would be within range of Iranian missiles. The Americans knew this, the Iranians knew this, and so before the match could be lit, Washington made a decision. Move the carrier strike group into the Mediterranean, not to prevent a conflict, but to shape it entirely on American terms. What happened next changed everything in the region's strategic calculus. As the strike group moved east through the Mediterranean, the U.S. military simultaneously activated and repositioned additional air assets across its regional base network. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, capable of carrying the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb specifically designed to destroy deeply buried and hardened underground facilities, were reportedly placed on elevated alert status. The massive ordnance penetrator is not a weapon you deploy against soft targets. It exists for one purpose: to reach underground nuclear facilities buried under rock and concrete, tunneled into mountainsides, shielded against conventional munitions. The weapon is so specialized, so singular in its intended use, that its very deployment communicates a specific message to a specific audience. Iran heard that message. Within days of the carrier group's entry into the Mediterranean, Iranian state television reported that the country's air defense systems were being placed on heightened readiness. Iranian naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz conducted what state media described as routine maneuvers, but which analysts identified as positioning exercises, moves designed to threaten the closure of that critical waterway in the event of any American or Israeli strike. 15 to 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Closing it, even temporarily, would send oil prices spiraling upward and trigger immediate economic turbulence across Europe and Asia. It was Iran's most powerful card, and it was now face up on the table. But this is where the bigger story begins to emerge. Because the Americans anticipated exactly this response. Buried beneath the news of the carrier strike group's movement was a quieter deployment that received almost no attention. Additional U.S. Navy mine countermeasure vessels and maritime patrol aircraft had been prepositioned in the Gulf region specifically to address any Iranian attempt to mine or physically block the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, had been quietly reinforced for weeks before the Mediterranean deployment became public. Washington had not simply moved a carrier. It had repositioned an entire strategic architecture simultaneously, like a chess player moving not one piece, but repositioning the entire board. Russia watched all of this with barely concealed alarm. Moscow has cultivated its relationship with Tehran carefully over years, selling Iran the S-300 air defense system, cooperating on energy projects, and maintaining a back-channel diplomatic relationship that gives Russia leverage in the Middle East and gives Iran a degree of great power protection it would otherwise lack. A major American military strike on Iran would shatter that protective umbrella and remind Moscow that its ability to shield its partners has real geographic and military limits. Russian naval vessels operating out of their Mediterranean base at Tartus in Syria began increased patrol activity. Surveillance aircraft were repositioned. It was a reminder that Russia, too, had equities in what was about to unfold. China was calculating its own exposure. Beijing imports approximately 12% of its oil from Iran and has invested billions of dollars in Iranian infrastructure under the framework of its Belt and Road Initiative. Any military action that destabilized Iran would threaten those investments and potentially interrupt Chinese energy supplies at a moment when Beijing could ill afford new economic headwinds. Chinese diplomatic channels went quiet and then suddenly became very busy as Beijing attempted to position itself as a potential mediator while simultaneously signaling to Washington that any escalation would have consequences extending far beyond the Middle East. And then came the development that no one in any of those capitals had fully anticipated. Intercepted communications and subsequent reporting revealed that Iran had been quietly accelerating the transfer of advanced drone technology and ballistic missile components to Hezbollah in Lebanon. A direct escalation timed, analysts believed, to coincide with the pressure building around Iran's nuclear program. The logic was brutally clear. If Iran was going to be struck, it intended to ensure that Israel would simultaneously face a threat from its northern border that would stress its air defense network, potentially overwhelming the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow systems that form Israel's layered missile defense architecture. A multi-front attack coordinated from Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran itself was not a theoretical contingency. It was a plan being actively prepared. The carrier strike group in the Mediterranean was now the single most important physical object in the entire geopolitical equation. Its presence did several things at once that no diplomatic note or United Nations resolution could replicate. It placed approximately 70 to 80 combat aircraft within striking distance of the entire Iranian coastline, every Iranian nuclear facility, every Iranian naval base, and every Iranian missile launch site. It provided an airborne early warning and control capability that could track hundreds of inbound threats simultaneously. Its destroyers carried Standard Missile-3 interceptors capable of engaging ballistic missiles in the mid-course phase of flight, meaning they could begin shooting down Iranian missiles before those missiles began their terminal descent toward Israeli cities. The carrier group was not just a weapon, it was a shield placed between Iran's arsenal and its intended targets. This is the part of modern great power competition that rarely makes it into the headlines, because it is not dramatic in the way that explosions are dramatic. The most consequential moments in these standoffs are often the ones that prevent the explosion from happening at all. Deterrence, when it works, is invisible. You never see the war that didn't start. You never count the casualties that didn't occur. But the military planners and the intelligence analysts and the senior officials in every capital involved in this situation understand exactly what the deployment of that carrier group into the Mediterranean at that moment actually meant. It meant that the cost of any Iranian decision to escalate had just increased by an order of magnitude. The strategic impact of this moment extends far beyond the immediate crisis. Washington has demonstrated, once again, that it retains the capacity and the political will to project overwhelming military power into any theater on Earth on relatively short notice. That demonstration matters to allies in the Gulf who have questioned American commitment. It matters to Israel, which now knows it has an active partner rather than a passive spectator. It matters to Iran, which must now weigh its next move, knowing that the margin for error has essentially disappeared. But perhaps most significantly, it matters to the rest of the world watching this unfold. The Mediterranean is not just a sea, it is at this moment the stage upon which the most consequential military and diplomatic drama of the current era is being performed. The carrier at its center is both instrument and argument, a floating statement about the nature of power in the 21st century. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now behind closed doors in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Washington, and in Moscow. One miscalculation by any of them could transform this standoff into something far more catastrophic than anything the region has seen in decades. The carrier sails on, the world watches, and everyone is hoping that what they're witnessing is the sound of a crisis being contained and not the opening act of something far, far worse.